Dobar dan svima, hvala vam puno što ste došli. Veliko mi je zadovoljstvo danas da vam predstavim profesorku Jo Shaw, koja je redovna profesorka pravnog fakulteta na Univerzitetu u Edinburgu, nedavno je gostujuća profesorka na Univerzitetu Tampere u Finskoj. Jo Shaw se prevashodno bavi evropskim pravom, evropskim institucijama i evropskim građanstvom, državljanstvom i Citizenship temom, a duži niz godina bavila se i problemom transformacije režima državljanstva i građanstva u zemljama bivše Jugoslavije. Godina je vodila jedan projekt koji se bavio ovom temom, projektom na kojem su učestvovali neki ljudi sa ovog instituta, profesor Rijana i mene, ali neki drugi iz Srpske akademske zajednice, da tako kažem. Tako da je to dodatna težina i važnost i plezir što je Jo, meni, danas ovde sa nama. I danas ćemo govoriti, odnosno Jo će govoriti o članstvu u Evropskoj uniji, o građanstvu, evropskom građanstvu i državljanstvu, dva specifična konteksta, najzad vrlo različita, post-Brexitovom i zapadno-balkanskom. Imamo Brexit situaciju gde postoje želja da se i napusti taj konstitucionalni i politički prostor Evropske unije, s druge strane postoje neka politička težnja zapadno-balkanskih država, već duže godine uporna, ali bez bilog ostvarenja tog cilja, žele da se uđe u Evropsku uniju i u ovom izlaganju Jo će pokušati da promisli značenje uopšte tih režima, građanstva i državljanstva u evropskom i ustavotvornom procesu kroz primere koji su stvorili kontekst Brexita i koji stvaralo prolongirano pristupanje nikada bez ulaska na vidiku ulaska zapadnih zemalja u Evropsku uniju. Neću dalje da dužim, dakle, predavanje Shunning and Seeking, Membership, Rethinking Citizenship Regimes in European Constitutional Space. Jo, it's an immense pleasure to have you here. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Hello everybody. This is the first time I've been in this institute for quite some time. I believe you've changed your premises. Maybe you've moved floors or something.
Yeah, we're for first floor when you were here.
Okay.
9 years ago.
Right. But this seems like a familiar shape with this window facing this way. But this is interesting, and I'm glad I wore black and white because I feel like I fit in quite well with the. I blend into this rather cool black concrete. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me to come here. I'm going to briefly present an article that's coming out very soon in a journal called Global Constitutionalism. Jelena has a copy of my preprint, which is open access. Yeah, but equally when it actually comes out as a PDF, I'll make sure that you get it because it's a Cambridge journal that you guys may not have access to. So I'm very happy to send you an off print of the PDF. It's a paper that's pursues this somewhat paradoxical question as to whether the two sites of my research, if you will, have something to say to each other. And I'll explain a little bit about how I came to combine these two things. At first sight, there seems to be, so what you've got in the northwest corner of Europe is a case of shunning membership of Europe's constitutional space, and what you have in southeast Europe is a case of seeking membership of Europe's constitutional space, but of course under difficult conditions. So I refer to it throughout the paper as stalled enlargement. And just before I go on to talk about this too much, I'm going to acknowledge that probably you're much more interested in me talking about Brexit here than you are in hearing me give my semi-formed ideas about Southeast Europe, to which many people in this room have contributed. So if they're semi-formed, they're certainly not those people's fault, they're my fault. So I'm very happy if we have more of a discussion about the Brexit scenarios in Q&A. The specific angle on Brexit that I'm going to take and on Brexit and stalled enlargement is to look at it through the prism of citizenship, because I'm a scholar of citizenship, you're a scholar of citizenship, Igor's a scholar of citizenship, and many of us perhaps around this table are also interested in ideas about citizenship. And at first sight, there seems to be little that these two cases of shunning and seeking membership of a supranational organisation have in common. But what I've been trying to do with this wee project is to push back against that assumption and to identify what type of analytical framework, which draws on legal, political and constitutional scholarship, is useful for engaging in a comparison of similarities and differences. Interestingly, there isn't that much on methodology in this paper, but one of the reviewers, excuse me, one of the reviewers for global constitutionalism made a very helpful suggestion that there might be something in Wittgenstein's approach to, I can't remember what the term was that he used, but anyway, I said, look, sorry? Family resemblance, that's right, that I should be using Wittgenstein. But then the paper was already 20,000 words. Sorry? It's what? No, I think it was Jim Tully. I think that reviewer was Jim Tully, in fact. There was something about the way it was written. Also, its immense generousness to my very flawed paper gave me to think it might be Jim Tully. Yes, Wittgenstein's family resemblance. And I said, that's a very useful idea, but I can't possibly add another 3,000 or 4,000 words to talk about family resemblance. So I don't in this paper. And the purpose of the pushback, which I think is the more interesting question in a way, is to look at the juxtaposition of two ostensibly contrasting European stories. And I use that as a term of art in the way that Calypso Nicolaides and Justine Lacroix talk about European stories. Oh, I've just got a message from Igor on my phone. It just came through on here. It comes on my watch. Yes, somewhat later. So the purpose is to illuminate some of the most important dynamics of complex, to look at these contrasting European stories and see whether it can illuminate some of the most important dynamic of the complex and differentiated Europolity with its multi-level and incomplete constitutional framework, and so helps us to reconsider the fundamental question of what does it mean to be a European. As to the framework for the comparison, I draw at length in the paper, but very briefly here, on a critique of how Europeanization, de-Europeanization, and indeed re-Europeanization play out within the EU's constitutional framework, using a case study of EU and national level citizenship regimes viewed from the perspective of stalled enlargement. So this is, in essence, the abstract from the paper. It examines the impact of the European Union upon citizenship and uses two cases of Brexit and stalled enlargement in South East Europe to study the partial, fragmentary and contested governance of citizenship. The case studies place the EU citizenship into a wider political and socio-economic context, demonstrating its central importance as an enabler of personal freedom. At the same time, they highlight how the denial of EU citizenship can engender individual strategies to recover lost or denied benefits. From the analysis, parallels emerge between EU citizenship and national citizenship. Both offer a promise of equality, but a reality of differentiation and inequality. So, this is a wee sort of story as to how I got here. I've been studying EU citizenship for a very, very long time, and I wrote a book in the last decade. I'm not so productive as Miroslav, who seems to produce a book very much more frequently than I do. The Transformation of Citizenship in the European Union, focusing on electoral rights. And that was really how I got to be interested in Southeast Europe, because I had a case study on Slovenia in that. And as a lot of people in this room probably know, many to their obvious pain, There was a project called CITSI. We presented it here in Belgrade and in this institute on numerous occasions, the Europeanization of citizenship in the successor states of the former Yugoslavia, funded by the European Research Council. And at the same time as that, though, I was also, from time to time, when I had time, looking also at the status of EU citizens in the UK, as my interest in more general EU law sort of waned as a consequence of the amount of time that I spent working on CITSI and doing various other things. So I sort of narrowed in on the question of how EU law on free movement is applied in the UK, and I had a small empirical project around about nearly 10 years ago now, at the beginning of this decade, on the problems of enforcing EU law on free movement in the UK courts in particular, and how it was dealt with by the Home Office, by lawyers in practice. So it was an empirical project in the sense that we did interviews of about 50 stakeholders who were involved, not citizens themselves, but elite stakeholders. It was looking at the elite framework. And so consequently, when EU citizens came to be the ultimate bargaining chips, if you will, in the Brexit debate, I felt like I had something to say about that, and I have done a number of papers focusing on Brexit and free movement, and I might eventually write a book on it, but I don't know, it would be too painful to write a book on it at the moment, I think. It brings out sort of post-traumatic stress, not to say also because everything changes every day, so it's just like pointless. We need a bit of history, and then I can do it. At the same time, what I've been now doing is a wider project on citizenship regimes, of which in essence this project is focusing on these two sets of citizenship regimes in tension with each other and with EU citizenship, and I'll show that diagrammatically in a moment, is funded by the Leverhulme Trust, and that's basically what's brought me here, because I have a small travel budget, but mainly the Leverhulme Trust buys my time, and that is the most valuable thing that any academic can have, is to have your time bought for research. So thank you very much to the Leverhulme Trust. And I also spend a lot of time, and quite a few people here have interacted with this, the Global Citizenship Observatory, what you might have known potentially before as EudoCit is now rebranded as GlobalCit. We went global a few years ago, and that's actually quite an old screenshot from a few months ago. We've got new stuff on there now, of course, and that enables me to feel that I have quite reliable data about citizenship regimes in potentially pretty much all of the countries in the world for the purposes of my Leverhulme project. Okay, so actually just before I go on to that, I just want to make a few comments about the relationship between the two case studies. There are obvious common elements and areas of symmetry between the two cases of Northwest and Southeast Europe, although they involve differing starting points and processes of change, not to mention contrasting political, social and economic circumstances. Catherine Baker, who's a modern historian who's written about this region, who you may well have had here in Belgrade, she argues that the UK and Yugoslavia represent two comparable multinational states with severe regional inequalities and unresolved histories of state and non-state political violence. And that's a quotation from her fascinating recent book on race in the Yugoslav region. Federal Yugoslavia disintegrated, pushing most of its constituent states from the front of what one might call the queue for integration with the then European communities, where it sat until 1991 with a unique cooperation agreement and serious prospects of an association agreement, to the very back. Brexit, meanwhile, is placing intense pressure upon internal boundaries and territorial governance within the UK, especially as regards the status of Northern Ireland, and perhaps less urgently, but nonetheless significantly, certainly for me personally as a resident, in relation to Scotland. It has been argued that Brexit could precipitate the breakup of the Union, and what we call the Union from our perspective is the Union states, Great Britain and Northern Ireland. the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Furthermore, the processes themselves are less sharp or simple than they appear to be at first sight, and the outcomes less clear. The UK wishes to leave the EU, although close observers, in fact any observer, will have spotted that leaving is complicated, and any departure may not result in the sharp break that many Leave campaigners have argued for enthusiastically since the vote. I say since the vote, not during the vote, but since the vote. The new states of Southeast Europe and Albania wish to accede to the EU, but are held at bay for a combination of political and economic reasons, many of which are outside their citizens' and governments' control, and relate to a reassertion of control in the context of enlargement policies by the existing member states. In sum, Brexit and stalled enlargement could both be dubbed cases of troubled membership or troubled non-membership, and that's a term coined by Carlos Closer, which I've slightly adapted. And I do this in relation to the specific case of citizenship, because I argue in the paper that very similar questions in relation to what might be termed the territorial rescaling of citizenship arise in relation to both Northwest and Southeast Europe. That's a term developed by and applied by Jean-Thomas Arrighi and Dejan Stepanovic, and they point out that the problem is thus not so much that borders migrate, but that they do so over people. And with its legal, political and identitarian dimensions, the transformation of citizenship within the European constitutional space offers, I would argue, an ideal test case through which to explore the processes of integration and disintegration which are occurring across the northwestern and southeastern borders of the EU. So that takes me to my first conceptual motif. I'm not going to discuss this in detail here, firstly because you don't want me to dribble on for too long, and secondly because it's boring. I just wanted to say a little bit about how I'm interpreting citizenship, because that's the first, as it were, frame. And the two, we need to think about the development of a concept of European citizenship, both because the concept of citizenship has changed over time, or at least our understanding of the concept has changed over time, and also because our understandings of integration have changed, and I'll come on to that in a moment. Now, the classic way of thinking about citizenship is to think of it as status, rights, identity, participation, a bundle of responsibilities. Those are, as it were, the classic and perhaps rather static ways of thinking about citizenship. But I would argue that while what states do in relation to citizenship in terms of status, giving rights, facilitating participation, being the framework for identity, should be understood as that while that's important, we need to understand citizenship rather as a relational and contested status rather than as a given. The history of citizenship rights show that actually the struggle for citizenship rights is perhaps the most important dimension of that. And Igor and I edited a collection of pre-published papers and wrote an introduction about citizenship rights, which I think is quite a useful frame for thinking about that. And a citizenship regime isn't a unitary concept, but it's a set of relationships nested within multi-level and plural sources of authority. So citizenship governance in Europe is not simply the product of one authority. It's contested both vertically and also horizontally. So in my work, I'm inspired by the idea of doing what one might call a constitutional ethnography approach to studying citizenship. That is to think about the lived details, the dynamic processes of change within citizenship regimes, as producing a better understanding of what citizenship is and how it is lived by citizens. And the second conceptual motif is to think about European Union, Europeanisation. And the general argument in this context is that an appearance of some simplicity, so the assertion that the European Union is a driver of integration, and that is, if you will, inevitably a centripetal process pushing, as it were, towards the centre, actually conceals multiple journeys along a continuum of integration and disintegration within the same geographical space and historical frame. So one of the interesting products of Brexit, and I can't talk about it here because there isn't time, but there's references in the paper itself, is that it's spawning more of a literature about disintegration, because people are also asking questions from both a political and a legal perspective as to how do you unravel, not only how do you ravel up Southeast Europe into the European Union, but how do you unravel in real life? We have all these nonsense people saying we get a clean WTO break, whatever that nonsense is. In reality, unraveling 50 years of regulatory interface, not to mention, human lives with borders moving across people, is a complex set of questions. And political scientists are asking the obvious questions, which would be what types of regulatory regimes are more or less apt for disintegration. And one interesting conclusion, there's been quite a lot of work done in relation to environmental policy, which is a multi-level competence in the European Union, and quite a lot of different agencies are responsible for different areas of environmental policy within a framework of a European Union environmental policy, of course nested within global goals and towards climate change and so on. In that context, unravelling the UK's involvement might involve, some political scientists postulate, not so much active unravelling, but perhaps more neglect, so that the UK's regulatory framework gradually differs because it's neglected and it isn't updated as the European Union regulation is updated. The area of citizenship is different, because although there is a multi-level regulation, in relation to certain types of areas, particularly the way in which borders migrate across people, have clear immigration consequences. So the domain of immigration law in the UK certainly is highly centralised. Environmental law is actually quite dispersed and devolved already within the UK, but immigration law is very centralised in the UK. So it's relatively easy by a series of simple measures to fundamentally change people's status in quite dramatic ways and in quite problematic ways. And so political scientists are starting to look more closely at those sorts of questions, and I think there'll be a lot more work to be done in the future. It's an interesting byproduct of Brexit that people are now looking in much more interesting ways at disintegration as well as integration. And then they're noticing that there are de-Europeanisation effects also in certain parts of Southeast Europe. So already the concept of de-Europeanisation has been applied in a number of scholarly articles to Turkey. And there's at least one that talks about it in relation to Serbia. And these are referenced in the paper if you're interested. So these are the frameworks that I use and I develop. I argue that you need to think about the tension between changes in citizenship regimes and the dispersal and fragmentation of citizenship governance at the same time as you're thinking about Europeanisation, not as unidirectional, but a series of flows, if you will, across along a continuum. So then we get to what will be, in essence, a very simplified presentation of what is perhaps a more detailed argument in the context of the actual paper. My sort of premise, if you will, is that as a result of geopolitical changes or non-changes in the dimensions of the EU, Brexit, stalled enlargement, certain groups of national citizens may remain or become or cease to be, or never become EU citizens, or lose or gain the privileges of EU citizenship through residence in another state that becomes or never becomes or ceases to be an EU member state. So clearly lawyers are going to have a great time over the next period of time. As I say, it's a story of citizenship and integration, and a picture of citizenship at the EU and the national levels as differentiated rather than uniform. We have a Europe of many citizenships, not a Europe of one citizenship. Those are there when I have more time to present those, present the case studies in detail. So if I'm doing like a formal lecture, which goes on for ages, I can present those. But this is the simplified framework, if you will, for multi-level citizenship in practice. So if you will, think about EU citizenship and national citizenship regimes. So what you get with Brexit is an impetus towards de-Europeanisation or nationalisation, although in reality that smooth transfer, although it might be quite dramatic in some respects, in the sense of what its impact upon people's lives might be, is uncertain and contingent at the moment. Although a lot of people have adjusted their behaviours and new regulatory frameworks have been put in place, which are really provisional when you actually look at the detail. In reality, of course, everything has changed on the 23rd of June 2016, but nothing has changed, and we're still living with that consequence. What's then interesting then is to contrast that with stalled enlargement and the process of Europeanisation, which has been a complex and sometimes troubling process of adjustment for a whole series of states. I go through this in detail in the paper. I don't want to tell you things that you all know. Anyway, you can read them and tell me I'm not writing things right in the paper, but hopefully I am. About, you know, cases that we talked about in the Citizenship project, Serbia and Serbia's adjustment of its citizenship regime to allow visa liberalisation, but only for some holders of Serbian passports and not others. The case of the Ohrid agreements in relation to Macedonia and the widening of the Macedonian citizenship regime, and various other case studies that we talked about in relation to adjustment because of, if you will, the trickle-down effects of being on a route map towards European membership or towards visa liberalisation, and of course all the consequences of then that process stalling and being denied and so on and so forth. What I'm most interested in, though, is the issue of how there are potential deflection effects, which then impact upon citizenship regimes. You can look at this across a number. You could look at the impact of Europeanisation. You could look at it from an institutional perspective, and I do in the paper look at it from the institutional perspective. But I'm also interested in it from the perspective of individual strategies. So if you recall in the brief abstract I gave earlier on, I'm starting from the premise that EU citizenship is an enabler of personal freedom, and it gives freedom of movement and various non-discrimination rights, which have a potential to give people additional life chances, and they create new strategies that people can pursue in different ways when they have the opportunity to go and live and work, as opposed merely to travel in the European Union visa-free, which is obviously possible for people from Serbia and a number of countries, but not from Kosovo, for example, still doesn't have visa liberalisation. And as I'm sure many of you know, the other complication in life is that you, if you're from Serbia, and you still need a visa to go to the UK because it's not part of Schengen, so there is that additional complication. So people are in these contexts constantly deflected, and there have been some fascinating cases in relation to what the UK has done. So behold, sitting over there, an Irish citizen. Who knew that he would ever be interested in the fact that his grandfather, who was a deeply problematic character, it's very clear from the family history that we've uncovered, and a Protestant to boot, was born in the north of Ireland before partition. So that makes Mr. Alf, as he's universally known in the Sitsi project, an Irish citizen, or at least he will be when he can establish and he can get his birth registered 68 years later, or perhaps 69 by the time we get it, 68 years later as a foreign birth. And then after that, when it's registered as a foreign birth, he can get his Irish passport. And there's quite a lot of that going on. I've barely had a conversation in the UK that doesn't consist of saying, so I think it's my grandfather, or maybe it's my great-grandfather, and great-grandmother, and so on. So lots of people are going through this process. And one, the conceptual question that those of us who are interested in citizenship would be interested in is, well, what are the implications of that? Does that mean the hollowing out of citizenship regimes, or does it mean the reconfiguring of the meaning of citizenship? And we asked those questions quite a bit when we were working on Sitsi, because as I'm sure you know, and it's in the paper, there are many deflection strategies that happen in the context of this region as well. I started really thinking about the hollowing out process, though, when I was doing some work looking at potential Scottish citizenship after a potential Scottish independence. So we had an independence referendum in September 2014. The result was 55% to 45% in favour of staying in the UK. And a lot of the rhetoric around the stay campaign was that the best way that Scotland could ensure its European Union membership, because after all, why would you want anything else for Scotland, was to stay in the UK. So that calculus has changed. But I was interested in what Scottish citizenship might be, because it would have been a case of secession, and the type of separation that Scotland was proposing, or the Scottish government in its white paper was proposing, was a real soft separation in terms of citizenship regimes, where they would have said, look, anyone like me, for example, who's resident in there would be able to get Scottish citizenship, but would I lose my British citizenship? Well, that would be up to the rump of the UK, whether I lost my British citizenship or not. But given the intertwining of the two citizenship regimes, you could imagine that for the first generation, like me, there would be uproar if people lost their British citizenship. Because we're not talking about the decolonisation process where it's the other side of the world, because that's the obvious comparator is, you know, what happened when India became independent, what happened when Jamaica became independent. And I mentioned Jamaica because that became very moot in the context of the Windrush scandal of people who had been in the UK for decades and decades suddenly discovered that the UK government thought that they weren't properly in the UK, even though they thought that they were British subjects when they came, but before Jamaican independence, for example, and they thought they'd become British when they'd stayed in the UK, and they hadn't become British. But anyway, it's a complicated story. At the very least, they definitely had indefinite leave to remain. That's clear. By statutory effect. But I mention those cases because, you know, in a sense you can separate two citizenship regimes reasonably easily if they're separated by quite a lot of geographical distance. You've still got that issue. But of course you guys know what happens when you separate citizenship regimes, when you have contiguity. Yeah, when you have contiguousness or contiguity, and then we thought about in the Tsitsi project a lot about what does it mean that when so many people have dual citizenship in the same geographical space. And I guess nobody knows exactly how many dual citizens there are in this space, but there's a lot. And the numbers won't necessarily, may go down over a very long period of time, but it affects so many children that it's unlikely to go down. On the contrary, in most parts of the world, the numbers of dual citizens are rising, precisely because rules have been liberalised and because there are more transnational marriages now than there ever have been in the past. Anyway, so what does this mean? Is it hollowing out citizenship regimes, or is it reconfiguring the meaning of citizenship? I don't have a simple answer to that. We can talk about that for hours. But there's just very briefly some examples of deflection effects, compensatory citizenship, and the impact of many citizenships. Is that going to zoom in? Yes. In Brexit, you've got naturalisation in the host state, so a lot of people are taking British citizenship. Citizenship via family ties and ancestry, other factors. Birth in Northern Ireland, oh God, don't even get me started, that's very complicated. For those who are born in Northern Ireland now, not those whose ancestry and then don't live there, but those who are born in Northern Ireland now, there are all sorts of other types of complications. Here, we've got kin minorities, kin states, open civic regimes, people trading up and trading out and taking advantage of heritage and so on and so forth. So that looks in a way like the dual or multiple citizens are the better citizens. They're the ones who are doing well. They're the ones who have more options. So where does that leave the statics? Are they equal citizens? I discussed that a little bit in the paper. And that's why I had that argument at the beginning that's core to the discussion, which is to ask the question, European citizenship, is it one of the, is it a way like some aspects of national citizenship, which is that there's always this ideal of and claim of equality, but the reality is differentiation and inequality. And so there are many shared features of Brexit and sport enlargement. Citizens who feel abandoned by state and public authorities. Somebody asked me to reference that. One of the people who reviewed this paper at one of its earlier stages asked me to reference that. Proliferation of individual avoidance strategies, the hollowing out of citizenship regimes, drawing attention to the highly differentiated character of both national and EU citizenship. And this is my conclusion in a way. Well, it's a conclusion and not a conclusion. Read the paper if you want the conclusion. It's all very exciting. But this one is, this I think in a way reveals that there's this deeper symbolic connection between these two problematic case studies that I'm looking at. On the left, you've got on the far left, you've got that that famous, anti-immigration, anti-Turkey, anti-everything.
More far right.
Yeah. And it was tweeted out by Nigel Farage, and I hope you can see that I didn't, on the 16th of June 2016, and I don't follow on Twitter. That's a screenshot from Twitter. And he tweeted himself out. Part is a picture of the poster, and the poster is I'm sure everybody here has seen that picture many times before. It's taken by a Reuters photographer, I think, taken on the Croatia-Bosnia border. It's the Croatian-Slovenia, yeah. It's a famous picture, but of course it deploys a trope of visual identity that is usable in all sorts of different things, which is effectively saying, you know, this threat at the borders, here at the Schengen border, of an undifferentiated dark people, all men, and you know, this toxic sort of vision. And there's Farage standing in front of it when it went out on a van. You know? so many visual representations there. And I thought that Maya Lovrenetz's note about that, refugees from the Balkanized Middle East marching through the Balkans to Balkanize Europe. And that I think represents this very deep connection between these two case studies, the way in which fear of the Southeast and the orientalization of the Southeast was part of the tropes that were deployed by the Leave forces to encourage us to think that actually our destiny perhaps lies as the 51st state of the United States and not as a member state of the European Union. So thank you very much.
Thank you, George.